Hello, another lesson in practical podcasting here. My name is Rob O'Connor with Waterford Institute of Technology. Today we're going to look at interviewing and some interview techniques that you can use in order to hopefully get some decent material for some podcasts. So we talk about some ways you can approach the interview, how you can prepare for the interview, then some practical tips around preparing questions, what you should do during the interview itself, very importantly, what you should do after the interview, and finally, we finish up with some just random observations that I've made over the years. As with the previous lesson, it's very important that we know who our audience is, because that will inform the level of questioning and the what way we're pitching our questions, bearing our listener in mind and the type of information that they might want to know or they should know. Just so you know, my own interviewing experience is limited. I've done a lot, but I do have limitations. I mostly interview musicians. That's for the radio show. For the podcast, The Machine, I typically interview IT professionals, programmers, security people, etc., etc. Academics, students. That's for the podcast. I have interviewed lots of other people, sports people, but I have no experience with the kind of adversarial interview, such as like interviewing politicians. I don't really have much of an interest in it either. But I don't think that kind of interview is beyond the scope of a course like this. If you want to do that, you can go off and do a journalism course. We've got to think about the aim of an interview before we go anywhere else. What's the point of doing an interview? So an interview is there because we want to get some information, or we want to provide some context to some information. We want to get somebody's opinion on a particular topic. And rather than just present the information in a very kind of dry format, we want to get it in the interviewee's own words. The listener can then form an opinion on how valid something is. Ideally, the opinions of the interviewer are irrelevant. They shouldn't really be in there. Now, again, that kind of politics arena, they should be completely disregarded. Another thing you want to be mindful of is an aggressive questioner can alienate an audience. You know, it can come across as maybe being too strong or too aggressive. We don't want that. Also, interviews are not a platform for totally free, unchallenged expression of opinion. Again, that kind of stuff is beyond the scope of what we would expect to be doing in these type of podcasts. But if somebody says something, you might want to question why they're saying it. The interviewer's job is very simple. Like most things, it's very simple, but not that. It's quite easy to forget some of these things. So it's about preparing well, asking decent questions, and also listening. The last part is the bit that people often forget. An interview should be a spontaneous event. For example, if I'm interviewing somebody, if I already know what they're going to say and they know what I'm going to ask them, it's pointless, because there's no magic there. What really good interviews sound like you're eavesdropping on a conversation between people who really know their stuff. It's a valuable element of broadcasting. You could argue that it's probably the most valuable thing that broadcasting and podcasting contributes to the medium. Some people are well used to being interviewed. Some may have received PR training. Others will have no experience whatsoever with being interviewed and recorded. You have to be mindful of this. Whatever about the people who have training, they're probably grand. But somebody who has no experience with being interviewed, they might be nervous, they could be a bit scared, they might not want to reveal information that's going to make themselves look foolish or anything like that. So just be careful about that, okay? And bear that in mind, okay? If you have interviewing somebody who has lots of experience with this, they might try and take over the interview as well. Again, you've got to be mindful of that and to ensure that you stand your ground and you keep your questioning along the lines that suits you. So when preparing an interview, the first thing you need to do is to get your interviewee, find your subject. You know, ask somebody, hey, can I interview you for this? You might need to get consent, particularly if somebody is a minor or underage, or they might need to get sign off from a manager or a boss to be interviewed about a subject. But once you get the interviewee, everything else should be grand. Then the next thing you need to do is arrange a time and a place to conduct the interview. You should let the interviewee know certain things, what the interview is about. So is it about a political expenses scandal? Probably not. Or is it about maybe some research that they've done? How long will the interview be? Will it take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour? That's important because they might need to book time off work. What's the context of the interview? Is this just a one-on-one piece, or is it going to be part of a larger discussion, and maybe you're interviewing other peers or other people who are related to that work? And also where and when the interview will take place. Again, it's the nuts and bolts information, but it's important. Oh, you also want to explain who the audience is. So again, thinking about identifying our audience back at the very, very beginning, because again, that might set the width of or the depth of the conversation. When you're preparing for an interview, you want to think about what you want to achieve. What kind of information do you want to get out of this? The interviewer should always be in control. You should be asking the questions. You should be leading the conversation. In preparing for an interview, again, you just want to think about what it is that you want to achieve. You want to get information about a certain topic, or find out why somebody did something in a particular way. Okay, you want to remain in control about those things. Again, you want, if you're asking somebody questions and there's details in those questions, you want to make sure those details are correct. If they're not correct, it just makes you sound foolish. So do your research. Often it doesn't have to be that complicated. This is not investigative journalism, but if something was introduced 2 years ago and you say it was introduced 6 months ago, it just makes it look like you haven't done your homework. So do the work. Normally with interviews, what you're trying to do is to get more information on a subject and or an interviewee. So bear that in mind and know what kind of questions you want to ask. Also, you should maybe try to anticipate the responses that you're going to get to certain questions and have some backup questions so you can maybe pull on some threads if they appear. Now, before an interview begins, this is often the most important bit because you're sizing each other up. There's no one way to do this. Some ways work better than others. Again, it depends on the type of interview, the type of person. Do you know them already? Are they a stranger to you? Are you a stranger to them? Often when I'm doing an interview with somebody, I like to sit down, have a cup of tea with them beforehand. We might just shoot the breeze about nonsense topics. It helps to set them at ease. Another thing I might like to do, particularly with musicians, is I won't want to reveal what I think of their latest album or a particular gig or something like that. I don't want them to think that, oh, this guy's a huge fan, or equally this guy hates our work. I try to keep that kind of stuff separate. I might discuss it after the interview, but not before the interview. But what you want to do is just kind of make sure your interviewee is feeling nice and relaxed and happy to discuss the topic with you. Also, if you're feeling stressed about conducting an interview, that will rub off on the interviewee. They will detect that you're feeling stressed and nervous. So try to be calm, okay? Another thing you should do as well is clarify how long you expect the interview to last. Because again, they might have plans for later on. And if they've allocated 30 minutes for something and then you're going on for an hour, they're not going to appreciate that. An interview is a conversation with direction. You should know roughly where you want to go with an interview and ask appropriate questions. Remember the listener, remember that audience person in your mind, as things are being discussed, you're asking questions on the listener's behalf, not necessarily your behalf. You might even ask questions that you already know the answer to, but you're asking on behalf of the listener. And this is something that journalists do very, very well. It's called informed naivety. I already know the answer to this, but I want to ask you so I can hear what you say on the subject. Much like the last time when we were discussing scripts, we talked about words being the building blocks. Well, there are certain words that are the building blocks of questions. Again, there's no great rocket science here, but it's important that we remember what they are. So words like who is asking for a factual response, usually a person, maybe an organization. When, again, another fact-based question. When did something occur? It's going to be a date or a time. Where? That's a place. Again, a factual question. What? Now, what is a bit more, a bit broader. It could be a fact or it could be an interpretation of facts. How? Again, that's not a fact-based question. We're asking for some meaning here. We're looking for an interpretation or perhaps even a sequence or how something might be done. Which? That's whenever we use the word which, we're asking somebody to choose from a range of options. And why? Why is a very broad question, and we're asking for an opinion or some reasoning or some justification for a course of action. Now, there's nothing unusual there, and this might seem absolutely obvious, but you'd be shocked at the amount of podcasts or even broadcasts that you listen to where the questions are ambiguous and they are open to a massive amount of interpretation. We have open and closed questions. An open question has lots of variations, and maybe that might be perfectly fine. How do you feel about something? To what extent do you think that? They're great for broad conversation, and particularly if you want your interviewee to maybe just wax lyrical about a topic, a broad or an open question is a great way to let them off. A really good broad question, open question, and it's the one that's often least asked, is why. It's a great supplementary question to have. So after you've got maybe some factual information, why? So what was the name of the project that you took part in? Why? Why did you decide to do that? And it just allows the person to go off on one. Closed questions usually have short answers, often factual. Where do you live? Did you sign that document? Closed questions are very useful to clarify information or get facts. The only thing about closed questions is that they can lead to very boring yes-no answers. So it's a good idea to have a follow-up question in the bag. So, did you read the report? Yes, no. Why? That allows some width to the conversation. Speaking about width refers to how much room for maneuver the interviewer is giving the interviewee. So closed questions usually don't have much width, whereas open questions can be too wide in some respects. So let's say, for example, I was talking to a band, a musical group, about their recent Australian tour. And I asked them a question: you've just returned from a tour of Australia. Tell me about it. First off, I didn't ask a question. I gave them an order to tell me about their tour of Australia. I haven't really said what it is that I'm interested in. They might start talking about the food that they had on the flight. They could talk about all sorts of stuff. Whereas I'm really interested in maybe learning about how an Australian audience responded to their music as opposed to an Irish audience. It's what I want to know, but I haven't asked that question. Okay? So they could answer it anyway. Australia was great. Where to begin? I should make sure the question width is appropriate to the point of my interview. Another type of question that you might want to avoid is the either or. So, did you introduce this new software feature because the market demanded it, or were you working on it anyway? The problem with that question is that I have closed the options that the interviewee can answer because I've introduced two choices from which they must pick It might be one of those, it might be none of those. It could be both of them, it could be something else entirely. A much better question would be, why did you introduce this new software feature? Rather than me prompting them with a leading question. Another thing with question technique is the role of devil's advocate. The devil's advocate, again, you will hear a lot of journalists use this. It's a way of taking a position that is at odds with your interviewee, not necessarily because you believe that, but just to present the counter argument to whatever they're saying. It's probably not something you're going to do in a podcast or in a podcast that you do for this type of material, but it is something worth bearing in mind, particularly when you're listening to material made by other broadcasters or podcasters. People play devil's advocate not because they maybe have that position themselves, but they're asking on the listener's behalf. It's an important one, and as you get more skilled at it, you might want to employ it yourself. A mistake that new interviewers often make is asking multiple questions at once. This can be very confusing for the interviewee because they don't necessarily know what they're being asked, or they're being hit with loads of questions all at once, and it can be a lot to process. So, say this here. Why did the meeting break into disorder, and how will you prevent it from happening in the future? Was there a disruptive element? There's actually 3 questions asked there. By the time they've maybe answered the first part of the question, they've forgotten what else they were being asked. So you're much better off asking short, simple questions and try to avoid long, rambling sentences. So how was it you embarked on this course of events? I mean, what was it you decided to do? After all this time, it wasn't the most obvious thing to do, was it? I have no idea what I just said there. So if I don't know what I've said there, how can the interviewee know what I've just asked them? Another thing you want to be mindful of is leading questions. And this is where you maybe introduce a value judgment in the question itself. Why did you start a business on such shaky finances? How do you know the finances were shaky? Unless the interviewee has already established that, you don't necessarily know that. And also, it can seem like your questions are biased. You'd be much better off asking a series of questions to get to that point. So instead of asking, why did you start your business on such shaky finances, ask, how much did you start your businesses with? That's a factual answer I'm looking for there. And at the time, did you regard this as being enough? It's either yes or no. It's a nice closed question. How do you view this now? I'm looking for an interpretation or a reflection on that. And if I wanted to, I could play devil's advocate. And what would you say to creditors, such as whoever, who regard this action as reckless? This can sound argumentative or probing. It doesn't have to be about massively serious topics, such as shaky business finances. It really could be about anything. But the main thing is that by asking a series of related and researched questions, the interviewee will offer some information, then maybe a reflection on that information, and maybe even a value judgment themselves, rather than you, the interviewer, putting words in their mouth. Another thing to bear in mind when conducting an interview is sometimes the interviewee may not answer the question that you're actually asking them. So asking why something happened may tell you how something happened. If an interviewee evades a question 2 or 3 times, just drop it. There's if they haven't answered at that point, there's no point in asking them again and again. Evasion is generally obvious to the listener if it's in that kind of live situation. Another thing you have to be mindful of, and particularly this is if you're interviewing subjects who aren't normally interviewed. If you're asking personal questions or sensitive questions, ask with deference and ask with respect, and do not be aggressive. So, the question, so if you're asking a question, they haven't responded in the way you wanted, with respect, the question was why you decided to go ahead with the clinical study, not how. Or, going through chemotherapy could be difficult for anyone. How did you cope, knowing you had a young family to look after? You have to be sensitive and you have to be mindful. Obviously, asking questions about chemotherapy, you're obviously talking to somebody who's in treatment or out of treatment. They would have to have agreed to that line of questioning in the first place. Another thing about question evasion is the non-answer to a question. It can happen by accident. Perhaps the interviewee doesn't understand what they're being asked, or they might have misheard it. But if you're interviewing somebody who has lots of experience, they might deliberately evade a question. Politicians are great at this. It's unlikely you're going to be engaged in this sort of adversarial questioning line. But just bear in mind, however, if you're interviewing somebody who's a novice interviewee and they don't answer the question, it might be because they simply don't know the answer and they don't want to appear foolish. If it's somebody who is experienced, they can be very skillful at this. My experience with question evasion is talking to people who don't know the answer, and they generally don't want to appear ignorant or weak, in which case don't push them if they don't know. Equally, I would always say to people, if you're asked a question and you don't know the answer, say so. Say you don't know. Nobody will think any the less of you. Well, not in my experience anyway. Another thing that I often hear interviewers do, particularly new interviewers, is make a statement rather than ask a question. So, your new album is heavily influenced by the Pixies. And then I'm expecting somebody to respond to that. I haven't actually asked them a question. And that indicates I've lost control. Because they might answer, they might say, oh yeah, it does, or no, it doesn't. Or they might just go off on one about their thoughts in the Pixies. They might not respond at all because they might just sit there waiting to be asked a question. They might decide to go off on a diatribe because they hate the Pixies and they don't want to sound like them at all, or anything else. Be much better off to ask somebody a direct question. How much is your new album influenced by the Pixies? It's quite a broad question. It allows them plenty of width to go off down any rabbit hole they want, but I'm asking them a question rather than just making a statement. Non-verbal communication is really important. It's very difficult to quantify this. There is a certain X factor associated with this. It's the manner in which somebody carries themselves. How comfortable is somebody talking to you? Do they know that you're listening to them? It can be very, very. It's a strange one. A little thing like making eye contact with your subject, maybe nodding to indicate that you're listening to them. Maybe you're trying to provide a warm, friendly atmosphere. You've got to be very, very careful about all those non-verbal pieces of information that you are conveying to your interview subjects as things occur. Unfortunately, the best way to learn these and the best way to learn what works for you is to just do them and gain experience. Okay, so during the interview, you're actually responsible for 4 separate functions. So the first one is the technical aspects, ensure that mics are set up correctly, that you're actually recording to where you think you're recording, you've got enough space, you've got enough batteries, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Other ones is that the aims of the interview must be kept in mind. What kind of questions are you asking them? Are they the questions that are appropriate for whatever piece it is that you're making? Also, if the interview takes a left-hand turn, maybe that's welcome. Sometimes the best interviews happen unexpectedly, or maybe you need to get something back on track. You've got to use your judgment there. If things do take a turn, you might need to think of some supplementary questions that are formulated ad hoc. You can write out some questions in advance, but if somebody says something unexpected and maybe you want to pull on that thread, you've got to just form those questions on the fly. The best way to form those questions is just by listening and being curious. Listening to what somebody says and just forming those follow-up questions in your mind. And time management is crucial. Again, if you've said something is going to be 10 minutes, don't record 30 minutes. It's not good for the interviewee because you've broken the agreement you made with them, but also it's not good for you, because if you record 30 minutes of audio and you've got to edit that down to 10 minutes, that's going to be a lot of work. So time management is key. There are ways to finish up an interview. Use the word finally once. Don't use it loads of times. Thinking about structure and signposting, finally indicates to the listener and also the interviewee that this is the last question. So don't use it willy-nilly. Sometimes you may want to summarize some points, maybe that the interviewee has said, or sometimes you won't. You might want to reiterate some details, but you probably don't want to summarize party political points, although again, we're not discussing political interviews. Always thank the interviewee for their time. Being polite costs nothing. The listener expects you to be courteous, and also it indicates this is the end of a segment. Very important. And then when you're finished and you've pressed stop on the recording, thank them again. Thank them for their time. Somebody is giving you their time, usually for free. So be nice. You may want to interview them again even. If the interview is recorded, check the start of the interview just to make sure the levels are okay. Very important. Do not let the interviewee hear what's on the tape. The reason being, most people don't like the sound of their own voice. They'll hear it and they'll start to cringe thinking, oh, do I sound like that? Oh, can I say that again? Do not do that. So maybe just check that things were recorded correctly and then thank the interviewee, tell them when the piece will be published, and go on your merry way. So, in summary of this section, the aim of an interview is to provide some facts or reasons or opinions on some particular topic in an interviewee's own words. The interviewer's job is very simple. Prepare, ask decent questions, and listen to what's being said. Good preparation will tell you what kind of questions you should ask and maybe you should have in reserve. You want to think about open questions, closed questions, and the form in which those questions will take. And time management is an absolute necessity. It's a key skill, but it's one you'll get with more experience. Now, finally, I'm going to make some random observations I've noticed from conducting interviews over the years. So the first one is be very, very cautious if you're interviewing minors. So interviewing somebody under 18 or children, you definitely want to make sure you have permission. You want to make sure it's in a safe environment. You want to make sure that there are numerous people around. It's not just you and the interviewee. So just be careful of that, okay? If somebody doesn't want to talk to you, you can't force them. So if you ask somebody for an interview and they don't want to do it, you can ask them maybe twice, maybe even 3 times. But if they don't want to do it, just leave them be. You can't force somebody to talk to you. So just let them off. If you are discussing a sensitive topic, be empathetic. Tread very, very carefully. If it's anything to do with a personal matter, you've got to treat the subject with absolute respect. Inexperienced interviewees can be very, very nervous and they're worried about looking foolish. And when you press record, they can clam up. They can clam up and they're stressed. So a good way to get around that, in my experience, is to ask them questions that they'll confidently be able to answer. Ask them questions about a sports team. Ask a question about a film that they saw. Ask them factual questions. Just you can say, I'm just trying to get a level on you. So while I'm doing that, could you maybe tell me, who do you support? Or did you see this gig the other night? Or did you see whatever? And just get them into a conversation. And by getting them into a conversation with some topic that you're fairly sure they'll be able to answer confidently and with no stress, they'll relax, and that's a good thing in my experience. Listen to what people are saying. I can never understand interviewers who aren't listening to what their subjects are saying. It's like Years ago, I worked with a girl who used to interview musicians, and she used to always approach every interview with 10 questions, irrespective of what somebody said. And I remember one time she asked a band about the recording of an album, and the way they were approaching the songs. And while they were talking about that, then they started talking about the studio that they recorded it in, and where it was, and what a great time they had it in the studio. And then the next question that was on her sheet was, so what studio did you record it in? And it was like she hadn't been listening to what the band had just said, and it's disrespectful. So listen to what people are saying and change your interview on the fly if needs be. Don't interject unnecessarily when somebody is interviewing. It can ruin the audio if your voice is going, yeah, aha, because you'll have all these hms and has and yeah, there all the way. You're much better off staying out of the way. A very good thing to do is to, you want to let the interviewee know that you're listening. So, maintain that eye contact. You can nod your head, shake your head in the appropriate places. You may feel like a nodding donkey, and you may think you're foolish, but you're not, and you won't sound foolish. That's the important thing, because nobody can hear you nodding with an audio recording. Be sound, be nice. It costs nothing, and you're much more likely to get repeat business as an interviewer by getting a reputation for being decent at it and being sound and being respectful. So the thing about interviews, the more you do, the better you become. I mean, there is a bit of a dark art to it. Sometimes you can have a bad day and just everything goes wrong, and other times everything will go your way and you'll just get these amazing pieces of audio. The best advice I can give you about conducting interviews is to listen to interviews. But instead of focusing on the subject of the interview, focus on how the interviewer conducts their work. I think you'll find that the best interviewers are often the ones the best interviewers are the ones where they actually say very little. They might just ask questions and then they get out of the way and let the subject tell their story in their own words. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you in the next one.